On the morning of February 9, 1945, a 21-year-old private from San Antonio, Texas, did something that should have been impossible. Armed with nothing but a Browning automatic rifle and 5 fragmentation grenades, Cleto Rodríguez walked toward a fortified railroad station bristling with machine guns and a 20mm cannon, defended by 80 Japanese soldiers who had sworn to die where they stood. By the time the sun climbed higher over the burning wreckage of Manila, Rodríguez would capture an enemy machine gun, turn it against its owners, and walk back through a hail of fire carrying his dying friend. What happened in those 2.5 hours would become one of the most audacious acts of individual combat in the Pacific War, and it started with a single step forward when every instinct screamed to stay down. Manila in February 1945 was not a city. It was a carcass, the Pearl of the Orient, once gleaming with Art Deco facades and broad palm-lined boulevards, had become a maze of rubble and death. The Japanese Imperial Navy's Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi had ordered his forces to defend every block, every building, every stairwell to the last man, ignoring Tokyo's orders to withdraw. His men had turned schools into fortresses, churches into artillery positions, hospitals into abattoirs. Civilians, men, women, children, infants, were slaughtered in their homes, in the streets, in the very places they had sought shelter. By the time the 37th Infantry Division and the 1st Cavalry Division began their grinding advance into the city's heart, Manila had become a killing floor unlike anything American forces had encountered in the island campaigns. The heat was monstrous. Even in February, the Philippine dry season turned the rubble into an oven that radiated back the sun's fury. Humidity clung to everything, soaking through wool uniforms, rusting metal, breeding infection in the smallest scratch. The air tasted of cordite and rot, plaster dust and something worse, something sweet and terrible that caught in the back of the throat and wouldn't leave. Fires burned in a dozen districts, filling the sky with columns of black smoke that merged into a single greasy pall. At night, the city glowed orange and the smoke reflected the flames, creating a false dawn that never came. Company B of the 148th Infantry Regiment had been in continuous combat for 5 days. The 148th was part of the 37th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Buckeye Division for its Ohio National Guard origins, though by 1945 its ranks were filled with men from across the country. They had fought through the jungles of New Georgia and Bougainville, had learned to move quietly through primary forest, to watch for snipers in the canopy, to expect ambush from every shadow. Manila was different. Here the enemy was above you, below you, behind walls 3 feet thick. Here you cleared a room only to take fire from the room you'd cleared an hour before. Here every advance was measured in yards, and every yard cost blood. Private First Class Cleto L. Rodríguez was 21 years old and looked younger. He stood 5 feet 8 inches, weighed maybe 140 pounds soaking wet, and possessed the kind of wiry endurance that came from a San Antonio childhood where you learned early that life didn't give you anything soft. His people were Tejano, Mexican-American families who'd been in Texas longer than Texas had been Texas, and he carried that heritage in his surname and his steady, dark eyes. He joined the Army in 1943, trained at Camp Walters and then Fort Ord, and shipped out to the Pacific with the certainty of young men who believe they're too quick, too careful, or too lucky to die. By February 9, 1945, after weeks of jungle fighting and 5 days of street-to-street horror in Manila, he no longer believed any of those things. But he'd learned something else. That you could be terrified and still move forward, that you could watch friends die and still keep your hands steady, that there was a place beyond fear where action became purely mechanical, a series of problems to solve with the tools at hand. His tool that morning was a Browning automatic rifle, the bar, 20 pounds of walnut and machine steel that fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the Springfield and Garand but did so fully automatic at a rate of 550 rounds per minute. The bar was a squad automatic weapon, meant to deliver suppressive fire while riflemen maneuvered, and in the hands of someone who knew its rhythms, short bursts, never hold the trigger, let the barrel cool, it could turn a firefight. Rodríguez knew its rhythms. He'd carried it for months, cleaned it every night, knew the weight of a full 20-round magazine in his palm, knew the precise moment when the recoil signature changed and told you the magazine was nearly empty. His companion was Private First Class John N. Reese Jr., a rifleman carrying an M1 Garand. If Rodríguez was quiet and watchful, Reese was the steady kind of soldier who simply did what needed doing without complaint or flourish. They'd fought together for days now, developed the silent communication of men who'd learned to read each other's intentions in a glance or a hand signal. In a rifle squad, you didn't need to like each other, though Rodríguez liked Reese just fine. You needed to trust that when things came apart, the man beside you wouldn't freeze or run. Reese was that man. The objective was Paco Railroad Station, a squat concrete fortress that sat astride the rail lines running south through Manila. Before the war, it had been an unremarkable transit hub, a place where commuters caught trains to the provinces, where freight was loaded and unloaded, where the ordinary business of a city flowed. Now it was a strong point in the Japanese defensive network, one of dozens of hardened positions that formed an interlocking web across the city. The station's main building was concrete block and steel girders, 2 stories high with a flat roof that offered perfect fields of fire in every direction. The Japanese had reinforced it, added firing slits, positioned machine guns to cover every approach. Intelligence estimated 50 to 80 defenders inside, and intelligence had been wrong before, always low, never high. The assault plan was straightforward in the way of plans that look simple on paper and turn into chaos the moment contact is made. Company B would advance from the north, using rubble and destroyed buildings for cover, close to grenade range if possible, then assault under covering fire from mortars and whatever armor support could be brought forward. In reality, the approach was a nightmare. The ground between the American lines and Paco Station was open in places, choked with debris in others, and all of it was covered by interlocking fire from the station and from adjacent buildings where Japanese observers waited to call in mortar fire. Men had already died trying to get close. The station's defenders weren't the starving, bypassed garrison troops the Americans had encountered on some Pacific islands. These were rear-echelon naval troops and army infantry who'd been reinforced, resupplied, and ordered to hold. They had ammunition. They had water. They had orders. They would hold. The morning of February 9th began with the sound of American artillery, the rolling thunder of 155mm shells walking across the Japanese positions south of the station, trying to suppress the defenses, trying to buy the infantry a few minutes of confusion to exploit. The barrage lifted and Company B moved out, spreading into a skirmish line, every man bent low, every man thinking about the 10 yards ahead and nothing more. You didn't think about the objective when the objective was 400 yards away and every yard was going to cost. You thought about the next pile of rubble, the next wall, the next moment when you'd be exposed and some rifleman you couldn't see would have you in his sights. Rodríguez and Reese moved together, staying low, using hand signals. The bar was heavy, but Rodríguez carried it easily, the weight familiar, almost comforting. They reached a shattered storefront, pressed against the wall, waited for the others to catch up. Somewhere ahead a machine gun opened fire, the unmistakable stutter of a Type 92 heavy machine gun, and men went flat. Someone was screaming for a medic. The company's advance stalled, became a desperate hunt for cover. Men crawling behind anything solid while the machine gun traversed and fired, methodical as a metronome. This was the ground truth of Manila's liberation. Every block was Tarawa, every building was Iwo Jima, and there were hundreds of blocks left to clear. The Japanese had learned from the island battles. They'd learned that banzai charges were suicide, that fighting on the beach was suicide, that anything which brought them into the open against American firepower was suicide. So they'd gone underground, gone inside, forced the Americans to come to them room by room, floor by floor, and extracted a price for every step. The American advantage in artillery, in air support, in tanks and naval gunfire, all of it meant less when the enemy was 10 feet away behind 3 feet of concrete. Rodríguez studied the Paco station from behind the storefront wall. He could see the main entrance, a dark rectangle gaping like a mouth, could see the firing slits on either side where muzzle flashes flickered. The station was perhaps 60 yards away, close enough to see details, far enough that crossing that space under fire would be a coin toss between living and dying. To the right of the station was a 2-story house, partially collapsed but with enough structure remaining to offer cover. It was closer to the station, maybe 30 yards from the entrance, and from there you'd have a better angle, could maybe suppress the firing slits, could keep the defenders' heads down while the rest of the company maneuvered. He looked at Reese. Reese looked back, read the question in Rodríguez's eyes, and nodded once. They didn't discuss it. There was nothing to discuss. Someone had to get to that house and someone had to do it now, while the Japanese were focused on the main American line. Every minute they delayed, the defenders would strengthen their position, would bring up more ammunition, would adjust their fields of fire. In urban combat, hesitation was death. Audacity, even reckless audacity, sometimes bought you life. They moved during a lull in the firing, sprinting bent over across open ground, waiting for the bullet that would end it. The distance was perhaps 40 yards, but it felt like a mile.
Rodríguez Lumsburnat.
The bar seemed to double its weight. His boots slipped on loose rubble and he nearly went down but caught himself. Kept moving, heard Reese's breathing behind him, heard the sudden crack of rifle fire but didn't know if it was aimed at them or at someone else. Then they were at the house, throwing themselves through a blown-out doorway, hitting the floor hard, gasping. The house's interior was a ruin of broken plaster and splintered furniture. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof. The walls facing the station had partially collapsed, creating a natural firing position with good cover and a clear view of the station's entrance and left side. Rodríguez crawled to the opening, brought the bar up, and looked through the sights. From here he could see figures moving inside the station, shadows against shadows, and could see the muzzle of the Type 92 machine gun protruding from a reinforced position on the ground floor. Behind it, visible only as a darker mass in the gloom, was something larger, a 20mm autocannon, designed for anti-aircraft work but lethal against infantry and light vehicles. Reese positioned himself at another opening, his Garand ready. For a moment they simply breathed, let their heartbeats slow, let their hands stop shaking. Then Rodríguez settled the bar's stock into his shoulder, took a breath, let it halfway out, and squeezed the trigger. The bar spoke in short, hammering bursts. 3 rounds, pause, traverse slightly, 3 more rounds. The weapon's recoil was sharp but manageable, the muzzle climbing only slightly before Rodríguez brought it back on target. He aimed for the firing slits, for the entrance, for anywhere he saw movement. Brass casings ejected in a bright arc, clinking on the rubble-strewn floor. The smell of burned powder filled the room, acrid and familiar. Beside him, Reese fired more slowly, more deliberately, the Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip giving a slower rate of fire but each shot carefully aimed. The effect was immediate. The Japanese fire from the station slackened as defenders ducked away from the incoming rounds, as ricochets whined off concrete, as the sudden threat from the flank forced them to shift position. Rodríguez saw a figure move across the entrance and fired, saw the figure fall. Another appeared and Reese's Garand cracked once, the figure disappearing back into shadow. The Type 92 machine gun swiveled, trying to bring its barrel to bear on the house, and Rodríguez put a burst into its position. Sparks flew. The machine gun fell silent. For nearly an hour they held that position, a 2-man fortress 60 yards from 80 enemy soldiers. Rodríguez fired until his shoulder ached from the bar's recoil, until the barrel glowed dull red and he had to force himself to wait, to let it cool, to resist the urge to just hold the trigger and pour fire into the station until the magazine ran dry. He went through magazine after magazine, each one heavy with 20 rounds of .30-06, each one expendable now because stopping was death. Reese fed him ammunition, passing up magazines scrounged from dead soldiers they'd passed, keeping up his own fire with the Garand, calling out targets, watching for movement. They killed. There was no other word for it. No euphemism that softened what happened when a 150-grain bullet traveling 2,800 feet per second hit flesh and bone. Men fell and didn't get back up. Men tried to move and were caught in the open and fell. Men tried to return fire and were silenced. Rodríguez watched it all through the bar's sights, watched with the peculiar focus of someone who understood that mercy here was death, that the men in that station would give no quarter and expected none. This was not murder. This was what valor looked like when you stripped away the poetry, 2 men alone holding a position against impossible odds because someone had to, because the mission required it, because the alternative was retreat and retreat meant more American dead when the company tried again tomorrow. But the mathematics of combat are brutal and unyielding. The bar held 20 rounds per magazine. Rodríguez had started with a basic load of 12 magazines, 240 rounds, plus whatever he'd scrounged. Figure 300 rounds total. At 5 to 10 rounds per engagement, at dozens of engagements across an hour, the arithmetic became clear. He was running out. The last magazine went into the weapon and Rodríguez felt the change in weight, felt the finality of it. 20 rounds left. Then nothing. He made those 20 rounds last, firing only when he had a clear target, only when holding fire would be more dangerous than shooting. Beside him, Reese was down to his last clips. The Japanese defenders had noticed the slackening fire and were becoming bolder, moving more freely, beginning to mass for what looked like a counterattack or perhaps just reinforcement of their positions. Rodríguez fired his last burst 3 rounds into a cluster of movement near the entrance, and the bar's bolt locked back on an empty magazine. He looked at the weapon in his hands, this thing that had kept him alive for months, that had become an extension of his will, and it was empty. He looked at Reese, who'd fired his last round and was now down to his pistol. They were out of ammunition, pinned in a destroyed house 60 yards from 80 enemy soldiers who now knew exactly where they were, and the American lines were hundreds of yards behind them across open ground swept by machine gun fire. Rodríguez set the bar down gently, as if it might break, and drew his .45 pistol. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. 8 shots. Against 80 men. The absurdity of it was almost funny, would have been funny if he'd had the breath to laugh. Instead, he looked out at the station and calculated angles, distances, odds. That's when he saw the body. It was perhaps 20 yards from the house, sprawled in the rubble between their position and the station. A Japanese soldier, dead from one of their earlier volleys. He lay on his back, arms outflung, and beside him, still clutched in his hands, was a Type 99 light machine gun. The Type 99 was Japan's standard light machine gun, a 23-pound weapon that fired the 7.7mm cartridge from a 30-round top-mounted magazine. It was lighter than the bar, had a higher rate of fire, 800 rounds per minute versus the bar's 550, and its distinctive muzzle brake gave it a characteristic sound, a high-pitched chattering that every soldier in the Pacific learned to recognize and fear. The Type 99 had been developed from the earlier Type 96 and Czech designs, incorporating lessons learned in China and refined through years of combat. It was reliable, accurate, and in the hands of a trained operator, devastatingly effective. Rodríguez stared at that weapon lying in the rubble. The dead soldier's body had 2, maybe 3 magazines visible in his harness. Maybe 60 or 90 rounds total. Not much. But 60 rounds was infinitely more than 0 rounds. The distance was 20 yards. Open ground. In full view of the station. In daylight. The intelligent thing, the sane thing, was to stay put, wait for nightfall or for the company to push forward, conserve what little they had. The intelligent, sane thing would also mean ceding initiative to the enemy, would mean letting them reinforce, would mean watching as they brought up more weapons and turned this position into a beaten zone that no American could cross. Rodríguez didn't think about it very long. Thinking was how you talked yourself out of things that needed doing. He caught Reese's eye, pointed at the body, made a quick gesture. Cover me. Reese's face went very still, and for a moment Rodríguez thought he'd refuse, thought he'd argue. Then Reese nodded and brought up his pistol. Useless at this range, but the gesture mattered, and Rodríguez was moving. He went over the rubble in a low sprint, zigzagging, making himself as difficult a target as possible. The Japanese saw him immediately. Rifles cracked and he heard the whip-snap of bullets passing close, heard the whine of ricochets, felt chips of concrete sting his face. 10 yards. 15. A machine gun opened up, tracer rounds drawing luminous lines through the air, but the gunner was firing high, not leading enough, and the tracers went over Rodríguez's head. He threw himself down beside the body, grabbed the Type 99, checked the magazine. Still loaded, grabbed 2 more magazines from the corpse's harness, and rolled behind a slab of broken wall just as a burst of fire chewed into the ground where he'd been. His heart was trying to break through his ribs. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped one of the magazines. But he had the weapon. He had ammunition. And now he had to make it back. The return sprint was worse because they knew where he was going and they knew he couldn't stay where he was. He waited for a lull, counted to 3, and ran. This time the fire was more concentrated, more accurate. Something tugged at his sleeve. Something else cracked past his ear so close he felt the pressure wave. He didn't think about it, didn't process it, just ran with the single-minded intensity of someone who understood that stopping meant dying. Then he was diving through the doorway of the house, slamming into the floor, and Reese was pulling him back from the opening, and they were both gasping and laughing because somehow, impossibly, he was alive. Rodríguez looked at the Type 99 in his hands. It was filthy, covered in dust and blood, but the action seemed clean. He ejected the magazine, 22 rounds left, he could tell by the weight, and slapped it back in. The weapon's controls were different from the bar but not wildly different. Safety lever on the receiver. Charging handle on the right. Fire selector, this one was set to automatic. The sights were calibrated in meters, not yards, but at 60 yards it didn't matter. You aimed center mass and let the weapon's natural dispersion do the work. He brought the Type 99 to his shoulder, found the trigger, and fired a short burst into the station. The sound was different, higher-pitched, faster. The recoil was sharper, the weapon lighter and harder to control. But bullets were coming out of the barrel and hitting where he aimed, and that was all that mattered. He fired again, adjusted his grip, fired again. The Japanese in the station heard their own weapon firing, and for a moment they hesitated, confused, trying to locate the source. In urban combat, auditory confusion could be as effective as smoke. If you heard a Japanese machine gun, you assumed it was Japanese. That half-second of confusion was enough for Rodríguez to put accurate fire into the entrance, to catch defenders as they moved, to punish their hesitation. He and Reese, who'd scrounged more Garand ammunition from somewhere and was firing again, settled back into their rhythm, but now something had changed. The Japanese defenders could hear one of their own weapons firing, could hear the distinctive chatter of the Type 99, and they couldn't be sure where their own people were, couldn't be sure what they were shooting at. The psychological effect was subtle but real. Friendly fire was every soldier's nightmare, and the sound of the Type 99 introduced doubt where there had been certainty. Rodríguez went through the first magazine, loaded the second. 30 rounds. He was more conservative now, more deliberate, making each burst count. The Type 99's higher rate of fire meant it could empty a magazine in under 3 seconds if you held the trigger, and that was a good way to die with an empty weapon. He fired, paused, watched for movement and eliminated it. Beside him Reese did the same. 2 men, 2 weapons, holding the line. The second magazine ran dry. Rodríguez loaded the third and last. Maybe 25 rounds, hard to tell, and knew this was it. When these rounds were gone, he was back to the pistol, and the pistol meant fighting at bad breath distance or not fighting at all. He had to make this magazine count. Had to make it do more than suppress. Had to make it decisive. He looked at the station again with fresh eyes, looking for something he'd missed, looking for the weakness every fortification had if you were willing to pay the price to exploit it. The entrance was a dark rectangle, maybe 6 feet wide, 3 feet of concrete on either side. The 20mm autocannon was just inside, positioned to fire down the approach but vulnerable from the flanks. The Type 92 machine gun had been silenced earlier, but there was probably another one, maybe on the second floor. Defenders would be clustered near the entrance, near the firing positions, ready to repel assault. The plan that formed in Rodríguez's mind was not complex. Complex plans fell apart. This was simple. Get close enough to throw grenades into that entrance, take out the heavy weapons, kill or scatter the defenders, buy the company time to move up. Simple. Not easy. Not safe. But simple. He had 5 grenades on his harness, the Mk2 fragmentation type, pineapple-shaped with a 4 to 5 second fuse. 30 yards was at the outer edge of effective throwing range, and he'd be throwing from a standing position to get the angle right. 40 yards from the house to the station entrance. 40 yards of open ground. 40 yards under fire from men who'd be waiting for exactly this kind of move. He looked at Reese and didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Reese saw what he was thinking and shook his head. Not in refusal, but in disbelief. Then he checked his Garand, nodded, and moved to a position where he could lay down covering fire. Rodríguez took a breath. Then another. He thought briefly of San Antonio, of his family, of the warm certainty of home, and then he put it away because thinking about home was how you froze. He checked the Type 99 one more time, 20 rounds, maybe, and stood up. The Japanese saw him immediately and opened fire. He was exposed now, fully visible, and the volume of incoming fire was stunning. He sprinted toward the station in a crouch, firing the Type 99 from the hip, not aiming but just pouring rounds toward the entrance, toward the firing slits, toward anything that moved. The Type 99 chattered in his hands, the muzzle climbing, the weapon wanting to pull right. Bullets kicked up dust all around him. Something burned across his thigh. A ricochet or a graze, he didn't know, didn't have time to know. 25 yards from the entrance. 20. He stopped behind a chunk of concrete that offered minimal cover, dropped the Type 99, and pulled the first grenade. Yanked the pin. Let the spoon fly. Counted 1 Mississippi. Threw hard and flat, aiming for the entrance like he was throwing a baseball, like he was 16 and throwing strikes for the high school team. The grenade disappeared into the darkness of the entrance. Rodríguez dropped flat. The explosion was muffled by the building's interior, but the pressure wave came out like a fist, followed by dust and smoke. Before it cleared, he was up again, moving right, pulling the second grenade, trying to get a different angle. The Japanese were screaming now, some in pain, some in rage, some just screaming. He threw the second grenade. Dropped. The explosion was sharper this time, and through the smoke he saw the 20mm autocannon tilt crazily, its mount destroyed. Third grenade. The defenders knew what he was doing now and were concentrating their fire on his position. The concrete slab he was hiding behind was coming apart under the impacts. He didn't have time to move, didn't have time to think. He pulled the pin, counted 1 Mississippi, stood up, and threw. The grenade went through the entrance and detonated deep inside. The machine gun stopped firing. Someone was screaming in Japanese, high and thin. Fourth grenade. This one Rodríguez threw sidearm, trying to bounce it off the door frame, trying to get it to land where the defenders would be clustered. The explosion came, and then there was secondary explosion, ammunition cooking off, maybe, or grenades, and orange flame gout from the entrance. Fifth grenade. Last one. Rodríguez pulled the pin, and this time he ran forward, closing the distance, getting to 15 yards before he threw it straight and hard into the smoke and flame. The explosion was immediate, and then everything was noise and heat, and he was turning, running back toward the house, legs pumping, lungs burning, and the world had become a tunnel with the house at the end of it, and nothing else mattered except getting there. Reese was firing, putting rounds over Rodríguez's head into the station, covering the withdrawal. Rodríguez was almost to the house when he heard Reese's Garand go silent, either empty or jammed, and then he heard something worse. The sharp cry, quickly cut off, that meant someone was hit. He reached the house and turned and saw Reese slumped against the wall, blood spreading across his chest. A burst of machine gun fire had caught him, probably from a position they'd thought was suppressed. Rodríguez was beside him in a second, hands on the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. But there was too much blood, too fast, and Reese's face was already going pale. "Stay with me," Rodríguez said, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears, too loud, desperate. "Stay with me, John. Medic! Medic!" But there was no medic close enough, no one who could reach them through the fire still coming from the station, and Reese's eyes were losing focus. He tried to say something, couldn't, tried again. His hand found Rodríguez's arm and gripped it once, hard, and then the grip loosened. Rodríguez held him for a moment that might have been seconds or minutes. Time had become elastic, meaningless. Then he stood, grabbed Reese under the arms, and started dragging him back toward American lines. The withdrawal was a blur of exhaustion and fire and weight. Reese was a dead weight now. Rodríguez wouldn't let himself think the words, wouldn't acknowledge what his hands already knew, and pulling him across broken ground while men tried to kill you required a kind of strength that wasn't in muscles. It was in the refusal to quit, in the absolute certainty that you didn't leave people behind, that whatever else happened, you brought them home. He made it 20 yards and went down, legs giving out, lungs screaming. Got up. Made it another 20 yards. Went down again. Incoming fire was lighter now. Maybe the defenders were consolidating, maybe they were dead or dying, maybe they just decided he wasn't worth the ammunition. He got up again. His vision was tunneling, the edges going dark. He couldn't feel his legs anymore. Couldn't feel anything except the harness straps cutting into his hands where he gripped Reese. Then American voices were shouting and hands were on him. lifting Reese away, pulling Rodríguez to his feet, dragging both of them back behind a wall where the fire couldn't reach. A medic was working on Reese, but Rodríguez could see it was too late, could see it in the medic's face, in the way he kept working anyway because you kept working until you were told to stop. Someone was shouting questions at him. How many defenders? What weapons? Is the position clear? Rodríguez answered automatically, the words coming from somewhere outside himself. 80 men, estimated. Type 92 machine gun destroyed. 20mm cannon destroyed. Heavy casualties inflicted. Position may be vulnerable to assault. He realized he was sitting down, though he didn't remember sitting. Someone gave him water and he drank it, and it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Someone else was bandaging his thigh. When had he been hit? And telling him he was lucky, it was just a graze, he'd be fine.
Lucky.
The word was absurd. Reese was dead. 70 or 80 Japanese soldiers were dead or dying. Lucky was a concept from a different world. A softer world. A world where people didn't throw grenades into dark doorways and drag their friends' bodies across rubble while machine guns tried to kill them. The company assaulted the station 20 minutes later and found it a charnel house. The 20mm autocannon was tilted on its broken mount, useless. The Type 92 machine gun was silent, its crew dead at their posts. Bodies lay in heaps near the entrance where the grenades had done their work, and more bodies were scattered throughout the interior where rifle fire had found them. The final count would vary depending on the source. Some said 70, some said 82, but everyone agreed on this. The station had been held by a substantial force armed with crew-served weapons and fortified positions, and 2 American privates had effectively destroyed it as a fighting position in 2.5 hours of sustained combat. Company B secured the station and moved on. There were other objectives, other strong points, other deadly yards to cross. Manila's liberation would take another month and cost thousands of lives. More than 100,000 Filipino civilians dead. More than 16,000 Japanese dead. More than 1,000 Americans killed and 5,500 wounded. The city would be nearly destroyed, second only to Warsaw in the extent of urban devastation in World War II. But Paco railroad station was done. Its guns were silent. Its defenders were dead. And the 148th Infantry Regiment could move forward. Rodríguez was evacuated to an aid station, treated for his wound and for exhaustion, and sent back to his unit 3 days later. He didn't talk much about what had happened. The men who'd been there knew. The men who hadn't been there couldn't understand. There was a gulf between those two groups of men that no amount of words could bridge, and Rodríguez had learned that trying to explain was worse than silence. The army didn't forget. Reports were filed, witnesses interviewed, the action reconstructed. On July 26, 1945, in a ceremony in the Philippines, Private First Class Cleto L. Rodríguez was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, for his actions at Paco Railroad Station. The citation read, in the dry language of military commendations, that he had displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It mentioned the advance to the house, the sustained fire, the capture of the Type 99, the grenades, the destruction of enemy weapons, the attempted rescue of his comrade. It did not mention, could not mention, what it felt like to run toward machine guns, to throw grenades into darkness, to drag a dying friend through fire. Some things couldn't be captured in words. Rodríguez survived the war and returned to San Antonio. He worked, married, raised a family, lived the kind of quiet life that Medal of Honor recipients often seek after they've seen enough chaos to last several lifetimes. He spoke at schools occasionally, when asked, always emphasizing that the medal wasn't just his. It belonged to John Reese and to all the men of Company B, to everyone who'd fought through Manila's nightmare streets. He died on December 7, 1990, 45 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, and was buried with full military honors at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. The story of what he did on February 9, 1945, endures because it represents something essential about combat valor. That it's not the absence of fear but the mastery of it, that it's not superhuman strength but human determination pushed to its absolute limit, that it's not glory but cost, paid in full, without hesitation. Rodríguez advanced when advancing seemed suicidal. He improvised when his ammunition ran out. He took terrifying risks because the mission required it and because his comrades depended on it. He succeeded not because he was invulnerable, but because he refused to accept failure, even when failure would have been understood, even forgiven. That's the story of Cleto Rodríguez at Paco Station. A story of courage measured not in Hollywood heroics, but in the simple, terrible arithmetic of putting one foot forward and then another, of firing until the weapon runs dry and then finding another weapon, of carrying your friend home even when home seems impossibly far away. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what ordinary people can do in extraordinary circumstances, please subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. It helps us tell more stories like this one, stories that deserve to be remembered. And leave a comment below. If you'd been in that ruined house, 60 yards from 80 enemy soldiers, with your ammunition running out and no help coming, would you have done what Rodríguez did? Or would you have found another way? I'd genuinely like to know what you think.